The guard's hand slid toward his cuffs before my door even opened. Red and blue lights splashed across my rearview mirror, bouncing off the gate like a warning meant to rattle nerves. The SUV behind me looked almost like a police vehicle. Almost. The uniform looked almost official. Almost. The badge looked almost legitimate. Almost. I'd spent 14 years learning the difference between almost and real, between authority and cosplay. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, voice steady, practiced, confident in the way only men who had never been challenged sounded. I moved slowly, one hand still inside my coat pocket, letting the moment stretch. Something waited there, something that would end this instantly, but not yet. First, I needed them to show me exactly who they were. 22 days after my aunt, Marilyn Holt, died, I drove to Ravenwood Estates for the first time. The inheritance packet rested in my leather case on the passenger seat. 960 acres of land I hadn't known existed until an attorney called me with the news. Before I say another word, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because what happened at that gate rewired everything I thought I understood about power, justice, and people who abuse both. The access road curved through thick maples, branches weaving together overhead, muting the late afternoon light. It should have felt calm. Instead, it felt staged, too polished, too silent, like a set after actors froze. The gate appeared suddenly, tall wrought iron, sharpened finials, stone pillars embedded with cameras. A glassed-in booth sat to the right. A sign listed 51 community regulations in type so small it bordered on parody. I rolled to a stop and waited. That's when the lights hit, red, blue, strobing across my mirror. A white SUV marked Ravenwood Security slid in behind me, sealing the lane. Two men stepped out in black uniforms with heavy belts and clipped radios. Everything about them was engineered to imitate law enforcement. The lights, the stance, the props, theater. The taller one reached my window, fingers already touching metal. His name strip read D. Mercer. He didn't wait. He yanked my door open. Out, hands where I can see them. I complied, slow and deliberate. His partner moved behind me, cutting off space. Textbook intimidation. License and registration. I handed them over. Mercer glanced once, then slapped them onto my hood. "You're not in our system. No resident tag, no guest authorization." I explained, calmly, that my aunt had passed and left me property inside the community. I was there to view what I'd inherited. Mercer's mouth twisted. "Property?" He grabbed my arm, spun me, and pressed me into the doorframe. "Nobody owns anything here without board approval, and I don't remember approving you." His partner opened my passenger door and pulled out my case, flipping it open. "Sir, those are legal documents. You don't have the right." Mercer leaned harder. "We do. Section 11 of our security charter. All vehicles and personal effects subject to inspection on entry." He recited it like gospel. I logged it mentally. Unlawful search, detention without cause, physical restraint. The list had started. A black sedan eased up. A man in his late 50s stepped out. Silver hair combed back, slate suit that cost more than most mortgages. Mercer released me instantly. The shift was surgical, predator to errand boy in a blink. "Mr. Hale, we have an issue. This individual claims to have inherited land here." Victor Hale approached, eyes scanning me the way landlords assess damage. He stopped close enough that his cologne burned. "I'm the president of the Ravenwood Homeowners Association," he said. "Whatever papers you think you have don't matter. I decide who belongs. Turn around and leave." I started to answer, then noticed movement by the booth. About 55 feet away, two officers were forcing an elderly man into a patrol SUV. He looked 78, thin, cardigan zipped wrong. "Please," he said, voice shaking. One officer answered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Curfew violation. Pedestrian activity after 7:30 p.m. requires authorization. Third infraction this quarter. $400 and an escort." The door shut. 30 years in his own neighborhood, and he needed permission to breathe after dark. Hale watched me watching. He wanted it seen. "I'll go," I said evenly, "but I'll be back. That land is mine now." He leaned in. "Land is dirt. Power is everything. I have power. You don't." He nodded to Mercer. "Run his plates. Put him on watch. If he returns, hold him until I decide." I left without another word. In my coat pocket, my fingers brushed the leather wallet holding my credentials. Special Agent Daniel Cross, 14 years federal service. But I didn't pull it out, not yet. 2 miles outside Ravenwood, I stopped at a fuel station. A text arrived before I parked. "Unknown number. Ravenwood HOA Security. Your vehicle is flagged. Return without authorization and you will be cited for trespass and harassment.
"Do not test us." I screenshotted it, created a folder labeled Evidence, then typed from memory. D. Mercer, physical restraint, illegal search. Victor Hale, directing unlawful detention. Elderly resident fined for walking. Title 18, impersonation. Title 18, deprivation of rights. They had no idea what they'd triggered. 10 days later, I returned, prepared. Court-certified inheritance filings, county surveys, the original ground lease from 1974, every page notarized and sealed. I dressed neutral, button-down, slacks, credentials locked in my apartment safe. I wanted to see how far they'd go with someone they believed was ordinary. I started the recorder on my phone and synced my watch, redundancy. Then I called a colleague at the regional office, heading back to Ravenwood. "If you don't hear from me in 4 hours, start protocol." She didn't ask why. Mercer was waiting outside the gate, arms crossed, 3 more officers flanking him. He stepped into the road, forcing me to stop. "Look who's back," he said. I held up the folder. Certified inheritance, deed transfer, lease showing the community sits on my land. I'm requesting access. He took the papers, scanned the first page, then tore it cleanly in half. The rip cracked through the morning air. "Forgery. Anyone can print this." "I want to speak to Victor Hale," I said. Mercer's hand slid, not to cuffs, but to a black cylinder with prongs, a stun device. Last chance, out of the car. I shut off the engine and opened the door. The moment my feet hit asphalt, 2 officers grabbed my arms. A third searched my car. Mercer circled me, device humming. "You're detained for criminal trespass and obstruction. You have no rights here. This is private property, and I am the law." They slammed me onto the hood. Cold steel closed around my wrists. One officer pulled my phone. "Recorder's on." Mercer smiled, powered it down, pocketed it. They missed the watch. I was shoved into the back of an ESUV and driven past manicured lawns to a building labeled Community Operations. Windowless corridor, small room, metal table, camera blinking red. The door locked. They left me there for 3 hours. No call, no counsel, no charges. I watched. The camera recorded. Through the door window, I saw a thick detention log, hundreds of pages, a wall map dotted with red pins, targets. A young officer brought water, eyes down. He didn't belong. I noted it. The door opened. Hale entered, immaculate. "Mr. Cross," he said, sitting. "I looked you up. No record. Just a man convinced he owns something here." He leaned forward. "I don't care about papers. This is my world. People who challenge me regret it." I said nothing. The watch captured every word. He stood. "Release him. If he returns, hold him overnight." They uncuffed me, tossed my phone onto the seat, and watched me leave. 2 miles out, I checked the watch. 3 hours, 17 minutes of audio. I called in. "I'm out." Relief on the other end. I looked at the marks on my wrists and knew I had enough to open a case. My apartment became a command center within 48 hours. 3 monitors, whiteboard, stacks of files. Same method, new stakes. This wasn't an HOA. It was a racket in a suburban mask, and I was going to tear it apart. The first anonymous email arrived 3 days after they let me go. No name, no signature, just a plain subject line and a message that cut straight through the noise. "I heard what they did to you with the gate. You're not the first. They've been doing this for years. If you're serious about pushing back, I can connect you with others." I didn't answer immediately. I suggested a meeting off-site, neutral ground, a coffee shop in the neighboring town. 2 days later, I was sitting across from Elaine Parker, 67, retired middle school teacher, silver hair pulled back tight, hands shaking slightly as she wrapped them around a paper cup. 6 months earlier, Ravenwood security had detained her in her own driveway. Unauthorized gathering, they said. It was her grandson's birthday. 7 kids, cake, balloons. They held her for nearly 4 hours in the same room I'd seen. When they released her, her mother's gold bracelet was gone. When she asked Mercer about it, he told her she must have misplaced it during processing. Processing. The word landed heavy. Elaine connected me to 4 more residents over the next week. The stories followed a pattern so consistent it felt scripted.
Minor infractions, invented rules, aggressive detentions, property confiscated, fines escalating into the thousands. One man arrested 3 times for parking his truck at the wrong angle in his own driveway. A woman cited weekly because her flower colors violated an approved pallet. A family forced to pay $11,400 after their teenage son played basketball in the street after 5:30 p.m. None had been read their rights. None had been given access to counsel. Ravenwood Security acted as judge, jailer, and collection agency, answering only to Victor Hale. I documented everything: dates, times, names, injuries, receipts. The file grew fast. The turning point came from Margaret Lewis, 72, a former bank compliance auditor who had served on the HOA Finance Committee before being quietly removed 2 years earlier. She didn't come with bruises or stories of detention. She came with numbers. During her second month on the committee, she noticed payments she couldn't reconcile, transfers to contractors she couldn't verify. When she asked for clarification, Hale told her the information exceeded her clearance. A week later, she was removed for performance concerns. The photocopies she slid across the table told the real story. Fines and fees totaled just over $280,000 in 24 months. Payments to Ravenwood Protective Services, equipment and staffing, $165,000. Additional disbursements to maintenance contractors, another $190,000. When Margaret cross-checked the contractor names against state registries, she found nothing. No filings, no addresses, just money disappearing. I ran my own search that night. Ravenwood Protective Services had been registered 21 months earlier. Registered agent, a downtown law firm. Ownership, sole proprietor, Victor Hale. He didn't just run the HOA, he owned the private force enforcing it. Every fine, every detention, every seized item flowed through a company he controlled. Mercer wasn't just a guard, he was a revenue generator. I called my supervisor. I need to open a formal file. Subjects: Victor Hale, Daniel Mercer, unknown associates. Charges: conspiracy to deprive civil rights, extortion, money laundering, fraud. There was a pause, then approval. Build it carefully and be careful yourself. The counterattack started 2 weeks later. A former academy colleague called. Dan, I just saw something about you online. Neighborhood forums. They're saying you're running a property scam targeting seniors. Within an hour, I found my own face plastered across community pages. Grainy photos from my first visit to Ravenwood. Bold red warnings. Suspected con artist. Claims to own resident land. Do not engage. Report immediately. The comments were cloned. New accounts, identical language, manufactured praise for HOA security. A smear campaign designed to poison the well before I could speak. I archived everything. Screenshots, timestamps, metadata. They thought they were burying me. They were writing exhibits. 3 days later, a legal envelope arrived. Cease and desist. Demands to halt contact with residents. Abandon property claims. Accusations of harassment, manipulation, fraud. A settlement offer, $45,000 within 30 days in exchange for silence. Attached was a motion for a temporary restraining order barring me from coming within 500 feet of Ravenwood property or residence. I recognized the tactic. Drain resources, flip the narrative. I hired a property attorney specializing in HOA disputes. She confirmed my ownership was airtight. Their motion was frivolous, potentially sanctionable. Then she pointed out something else. The motion was signed by a county judge whose name rang a bell. I found it in a campaign finance report from 3 years prior. Hale had donated $14,500 to that judge's re-election. 2 board members had added $7,500 more. I flagged it. Follow the money. Elaine called that night with more. An accounting clerk had confided that Mercer received 2 monthly payments, a standard salary and a second deposit from something called the Community Enhancement Fund, controlled solely by Hale. Over $38,000 annually. No documentation, no oversight. Worse, some resident fines never entered HOA accounts at all. They went elsewhere. The board never saw them. I stared at the board in my apartment. Hale at the center, Mercer tethered tight, shell companies branching out, victims wringing the edges, missing funds bleeding into the dark. The HOA's annual meeting was scheduled in 14 days. Their bylaws allowed any party with legitimate legal interests to request speaking time. I owned the land beneath every house. I sent a certified letter requesting a slot.
Then I prepared, not a full reveal, just enough to force a reaction, enough to make them expose themselves. The Ravenwood Community Center was a low, glass-fronted building with harsh fluorescent lights. I arrived at 6:40 p.m., 15 minutes early. The lot was half full. Families, retirees, people trained to keep quiet. I parked away from the patrol SUVs near the entrance. My briefcase held deeds, surveys, summaries. My credentials waited in my jacket. I texted my colleague, going in. Inside, about 100 residents filled folding chairs. Hale sat centered at the front table, like a judge. Mercer stood to his right, scanning faces. I took a seat mid-row, Elaine near the back, Margaret on the aisle, others scattered. No eye contact. Surprise was everything. Hale opened with practiced calm, budgets without details, maintenance without specifics, security praised. Then he announced a 22% fee increase, no vote, no discussion. When he reached public comment, his eyes locked on me. We have a request from a non-resident. Only dues-paying members may address the board. I stood. Your bylaws allow any party with legitimate legal interest. My name is Daniel Cross. 3 months ago, my Aunt Marilyn Holt passed away. Her estate includes 960 acres, the land this community sits on. I held up the certified documents. I'm not a trespasser. I'm your landlord. Whispers rippled. Hale's face hardened. Mr. Mercer, remove him. Mercer stepped into the aisle, hand on cuffs. You're under arrest for trespass and fraud. He reached for my shoulder. I stepped back and pulled my wallet free. The badge caught the light. Special Agent Daniel Cross, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The room went silent. Mercer froze. Hale stood abruptly. That's fake. Call the police. The doors opened. 2 FBI agents, 2 state troopers. We received the signal, my colleague said. You attempted to arrest a federal agent, I said. That's a felony. I turned so the room could see. This HOA is under investigation for false imprisonment, extortion, money laundering, and fraud. Hale lunged forward, then stopped as a trooper intercepted him. Mercer bolted toward an exit. 2 agents cut him off. Daniel Mercer, you are under arrest. The cuffs clicked shut on his wrists. Hale tried to posture. The warrant unfolded in front of him. Conspiracy, extortion, fraud, money laundering. His voice failed. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone as he was cuffed like the residents he'd terrorized. A young guard stepped forward, Evan, the one who'd brought me water. I want to cooperate, he said. I nodded. The center erupted. Evidence teams moved in. Logs showed 209 detentions over 3 years. Financials revealed $410,000 extracted. A safe in Mercer's office held jewelry, cash, cards. Elaine's bracelet was there. Cameras told the rest. Residents restrained, threatened, processed. One file stopped me. An 81-year-old man collapsed during detention. He died 2 weeks later. No report filed. The case exploded outward. Political donations, shell companies, silence bought. 8 months later, the courthouse filled. Charges read, testimony stacked, verdicts delivered. Hale sentenced to 21 years, Mercer to 17, restitution ordered. The gates fell quiet. 18 months later, I drove through Ravenwood again. The booth was empty. No lights, no intimidation. Elaine stood at a small ceremony, bracelet restored. A bench read, no curfew for free.
The fallout didn't slow after the arrests. It accelerated. Within 24 hours of the meeting, Ravenwood Estates transformed from a closed community into an open wound. Federal vehicles lined the entrance road. Evidence tape crossed the doors of the community operations building. Residents gathered in clusters, whispering, watching men they had feared for years walk out in handcuffs. But the real work didn't happen in public. It happened in borrowed offices, late nights, and silent rooms filled with paper, screens, and voices that had finally decided to speak. I stayed on site for the first 72 hours, not because I had to, but because momentum matters in cases like this. Hesitation gives abusers time to regroup. Every detention log, every hard drive, every locked cabinet was cataloged and boxed. The logbook I had glimpsed during my own confinement was worse than I imagined. 209 entries, each one a resident's name, date, alleged violation, duration of detention, and processing outcome. Some were marked fee assessed, others read property held. A few simply said warning issued, which usually meant hours locked at a room until fear did the rest. None referenced local law enforcement, none mentioned warrants, none included legal counsel. It was a shadow system, complete and deliberate.
The financial trail was equally methodical. Ravenwood Protective Services funneled revenue through 3 subsidiary accounts before it reached Victor Hale. Each step blurred the origin just enough to create plausible deniability. The so-called Community Enhancement Fund acted as a slush account. Over $360,000 passed through it in 30 months. No oversight, no board approval. Payments labeled consulting, equipment depreciation, emergency response readiness, fiction stacked on fiction. When we opened Mercer's office safe, the inventory told a human story behind the numbers. Watches engraved with initials, wedding bands, folded cash envelopes labeled with addresses. Fear had been profitable. The young officer, Evan Brooks, sat with agents for nearly 8 hours straight. He didn't hedge, he didn't bargain. He told everything. Training sessions where Mercer taught them how to phrase commands to sound legal without being legal, scripts for detentions, instructions on when to confiscate phones, guidelines for escalating fines until residents learned. Hale attended those meetings, approved the language, approved the tactics. Evan admitted he'd quit twice in his head before ever saying it out loud. When he finally did, Mercer threatened to flag him, ruin his employment prospects, and fine his parents' house for non-existent violations. He stayed. Shame works as well as fear. By the end of the week, the U.S. Attorney's Office expanded the case scope. Subpoenas went out to banks, contractors, political committees. The campaign finance thread unraveled quickly. Hale hadn't just donated to one judge, he'd spread money strategically, $6,000 here, $9,500 there, through shell donors tied back to HOA funds. The pattern wasn't bribery in the crude sense, it was insulation, a network of favors designed to slow scrutiny and discourage curiosity. It worked for years, until it didn't. Media coverage intensified. Residents who had never spoken to anyone beyond their fences gave interviews. Some cried, some shook with anger. The smear campaign against me collapsed under scrutiny. Screenshots of the HOA's posts circulated beside arrest photos. The narrative flipped fast. Where Hale once stood as a protector, he now looked like what he was, a man who built authority by imitation and enforced it with fear. 2 weeks after the arrests, the court appointed a temporary receiver to dissolve the HOA. All enforcement actions ceased immediately. Fines were frozen, accounts were locked. For the first time in years, Ravenwood existed without patrols, without threats, without a man deciding who could walk after dark. The silence was different this time. It wasn't controlled, it was free. The trial schedule moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming, the cooperation solid. Hale's attorneys tried delay tactics, motions to suppress, claims of improper procedure, arguments about jurisdiction, none stuck. Mercer attempted to distance himself, painting Hale as the architect. Evan's testimony cut through that lie in minutes. The footage did the rest. Video doesn't forget. It doesn't reinterpret. It just shows. I testified midway through the proceedings. I kept it factual. Dates, actions, words spoken. The defense tried to frame my concealment of credentials as deception. The judge shut it down. I wasn't undercover. I was a citizen being abused by men impersonating authority. My profession didn't grant them permission. It exposed their crimes. The victims followed. Elaine Parker held the bracelet in an evidence bag with shaking hands. Margaret Lewis walked the jury through spreadsheets with surgical precision. Bernard Cole, the man fined for walking, described the moment he realized his neighborhood had turned against him. The hardest testimony came from Thomas Reed's daughter. She was the elderly man who collapsed during detention. She described getting a call with no details, no apology, no report. The footage played. The room went still. Hale stared straight ahead. The verdicts came faster than expected. Guilty across the board on the major counts: conspiracy, extortion, fraud, money laundering, civil rights violations. When sentencing arrived weeks later, the judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke about trust, about imitation of law, about the danger of private power unmoored from accountability. Hale received 21 years, Mercer 17. Others followed with lesser sentences based on involvement. Evan received probation and mandated service. Cooperation matters. Restitution hearings took months. Assets were seized, accounts unwound. Residents were reimbursed, items returned. Not everything could be recovered, but enough to make the point, enough to restore dignity where money couldn't. 18 months after the gates fell quiet, Ravenwood voted in a new association, transparent bylaws, rotating leadership, independent audits, no private security with flashing lights, no detentions, no secret funds. The land remained mine, leased fairly, managed openly. I didn't want control, I wanted closure. On my last walk through the community, I passed the bench installed near the park. Freedom has no curfew. It was simple, accurate. Children ran past without fear of being written up. An elderly couple walked slowly, unbothered by the time. The cameras were still there, but they served the residents now, not a regime.
I stood there for a while, listening to ordinary sounds return to a place that had forgotten them. Justice didn't arrive loudly. It arrived thoroughly, and when it was done, it didn't ask for applause.
The sentencing didn't end the work. It changed its shape. Once the courtroom emptied and the headlines shifted, the quieter consequences began unfolding. Ravenwood's accounts were frozen pending restitution distribution, and the receiver moved through the books with surgical patience. Every transfer, every invoice, every mislabeled expense was traced back to its source. Residents who had spent years assuming the numbers were too complicated to question suddenly saw them laid out in plain language. Fear had been expensive. Silence had cost even more. Over the next 3 months, checks went out in waves. Some were small, refunds for fines that never should have existed. Others were substantial, repayment for vehicles seized, jewelry lost, or fees stacked until families had emptied savings accounts just to breathe again. Each envelope carried a court seal and a letter explaining what had been taken, how it had been taken, and why it was being returned. For many, it was the first official acknowledgement that what happened to them had been wrong. I stayed involved, not as an enforcer, but as a witness to the unwind. The receiver asked questions I'd asked months earlier, now with authority behind them. Why did Ravenwood Protective Services bill for equipment that never arrived? Why were emergency readiness drills paid quarterly with no reports? Why did the Community Enhancement Fund operate outside the bylaws? Each answer led to another threat, and each thread ended at the same place. Victor Hale hadn't built a system accidentally. He'd engineered it to reward compliance and punish curiosity. The men beneath him followed because it paid, and because no one had ever stopped them. The civil suits followed fast. Residents who had been detained filed claims for false imprisonment, emotional distress, and property loss. The defense tried to argue waiver clauses and arbitration provisions buried in HOA paperwork. Judges rejected them one by one. Contracts signed under threat weren't contracts. Consent extracted by fear wasn't consent. Precedents were set quietly, case by case, expanding outward from Ravenwood into other communities watching closely. Attorneys began calling my office, asking for documentation, transcripts, patterns. The story had become a template. One afternoon, Elaine Parker stopped by my apartment with coffee and a thin smile that carried relief instead of tension for the first time. She'd received her bracelet back the week before. She didn't wear it yet. I wanted to see it on my table for a while, she said, just to know it was really mine again. We talked about ordinary things, weather, her grandson starting school, the noise returning to the park. When she left, she hugged me once, firm and brief. No speech, no gratitude that asked for anything in return. That mattered more than she knew. The receiver dissolved the old HOA officially at the end of the quarter. Assets transferred, contracts terminated. Ravenwood Protective Services ceased to exist on paper and in practice. The new association formed slowly, deliberately. Term limits were written in plain language. Financial statements were posted publicly. Independent audits were mandatory. No private security vehicles with lights. No detentions for rule violations. Disputes routed to mediation, then court if necessary. Ordinary systems replaced extraordinary abuse. It wasn't perfect, but it was accountable. Outside Ravenwood, the case echoed. I received messages from residents in other developments, different names, same patterns, flashing lights at private gates, security uniforms that leaned just close enough to police to intimidate, processing fees, curfews, confiscations. The Michelle Holt Legal Defense Fund took its first calls and filled its first calendar within weeks. Volunteer attorneys signed on. Law students asked to help. We didn't advertise aggressively. We didn't need to. Word traveled fast where fear had lived for years. Hale's appeal was filed quietly and denied just as quietly. The appellate court didn't find novelty in his arguments. Impersonation was impersonation. Deprivation was deprivation. Money laundering didn't become legal because it wore a neighborhood logo. Mercer attempted a sentence reduction through post-conviction cooperation, offering details we already had. It shaved months, not years. Prison doesn't erase the damage done, it acknowledges it. I visited the community once more before winter. No escort, no suspicion. I walked the long curve of the road where the gate had first appeared, now open during the day, staffed only by a small sign with contact information for the association office. Children rode bikes past me without slowing. An older man waved from his porch. The air felt unguarded. That mattered. At the community center, a bulletin board listed upcoming meetings, gardening schedules, a lost dog notice. Ordinary things reclaim space when control recedes. I stood in the hallway outside the room where I'd been locked for hours, the camera removed, the door replaced with glass. Transparency isn't symbolic when it's physical, it's practical. A few weeks later, the fund's first annual report went out.
46 families assisted, 3 states involved, 0 settlements requiring silence. That last number was intentional. Silence had been the currency of abuse. We weren't buying it back. We were breaking its value. I testified once more before a state committee reviewing private security regulation. No drama, no theatrics, just facts. How imitation authority spreads. How unchecked power migrates towards profit. How oversight fails when it's optional. The recommendations were narrow and enforceable. Clearer uniform standards, explicit prohibitions on detention, mandatory reporting to local law enforcement, criminal penalties for impersonation without loopholes. Laws don't fix people, they limit damage. On a quiet evening, nearly a year after the verdicts, I received a handwritten note. It was from Bernard Cole, the man fined for walking. He wrote about the bench near the park, about sitting there at dusk without watching the clock. He didn't mention Ravenwood by name. He didn't need to. He ended with one line: "I didn't know peace could be so ordinary." I kept the note in my desk. Justice doesn't always look like closure. Sometimes it looks like routines returning. Sometimes it looks like nothing happening at all. That's when you know the noise has been replaced by something better.
The months after restitution settled into a quieter rhythm, but the work never truly paused. It shifted outward, away from Ravenwood and into places that looked different on the surface, yet echoed the same pattern beneath. I spent long days reviewing intake forms for the defense fund, reading accounts that mirrored each other with unsettling precision. Different community names, different uniforms, different rule books, but the same language of threat and control. Private gates, flashing lights, processing, administrative holds. People trained to believe resistance would only make it worse. Each story carried its own details, but the structure was identical, like copies traced from a single template. One case pulled my attention early. A coastal development several states south had contracted a private security firm that issued citations styled to resemble municipal tickets. Residents paid because the paper looked official and the consequences sounded real. When one homeowner refused, the guards detained him in a clubhouse office for nearly 2 hours and confiscated his phone. The HOA president later described it as an internal compliance discussion. The words were familiar. I forwarded the file to an attorney on our roster and flagged it for immediate action. The pattern was spreading because it had worked before. Sunlight slows that down. As the fund expanded, so did the resistance. Letters arrived accusing us of stirring unrest, of undermining community harmony, of exaggerating isolated incidents. A trade association for private security firms released a statement warning against federal overreach and mischaracterization of lawful protective services. The language was polished and vague, designed to sound reasonable without addressing specifics. We responded with case numbers, statutes, transcripts. Precision beats posture. I was invited to speak at a closed-door session with state regulators considering updates to private security licensing. No cameras, no press, just officials and binders. I walked them through Ravenwood without theatrics, emphasizing how quickly imitation authority becomes normalized when no one draws lines, how residents hesitate to call police because they're told issues are internal, how uniforms and vehicles blur just enough to coerce compliance. The room stayed quiet. At the end, one regulator asked the only question that mattered: how do we stop this before it starts? The answer wasn't dramatic. Clear prohibitions, mandatory reporting, real penalties, oversight that doesn't depend on complaints from people already afraid. Back at Ravenwood, the new association held its first fully open election. Attendance was higher than anyone expected. People who would learn to stay silent lined up to speak, not to accuse, but to participate. The agenda ran long. No one rushed it. Decisions were slow, sometimes messy, but visible. That visibility mattered. Control thrives in the dark. Accountability prefers light. I walked the perimeter road one evening with a clipboard and a local surveyor reviewing lease boundaries. The land was still mine on paper, but the community felt like its own again. Ownership didn't need to be asserted to be respected. We discussed routine maintenance, drainage improvements, the placement of public access signs, ordinary governance replacing spectacle. When we finished, I sat on the bench near the park and watched the light fade. The absence of patrols was noticeable. No engines idling, no radios crackling, just wind and distant conversation. A year after the convictions, the first civil judgments finalized. Insurance carriers paid out, personal assets were liquidated, funds were distributed. Some residents used the money to repair what had been damaged. Others donated portions to the defense fund quietly, without ceremony.
A few chose to leave Ravenwood entirely, carrying relief with them like luggage set down at last. Justice doesn't require everyone to stay. Not every story ended cleanly. Some cases stalled in local courts, some HOAs folded before accountability arrived, dissolving into paperwork to avoid scrutiny. We tracked those too, documenting evasions, sharing strategies across jurisdictions. Progress wasn't linear, but it was cumulative. Each win made the next one easier. I received an invitation to lecture at a law school clinic focused on housing rights. The students asked sharp questions, skeptical and curious. They wanted tactics, not slogans. I talked about documentation, about patience, about how power reacts when challenged. I told them the most important evidence often comes from the quietest witnesses, the ones who apologize before speaking, the ones who think their story doesn't matter because nothing that bad happened. It all matters. Patterns are built from small, repeated acts. Late one night, sorting through correspondence, I found a short message forwarded from a volunteer attorney. A client wanted to withdraw their complaint now that the HOA had backed off. They didn't want trouble, they didn't want attention, they wanted peace. I understood. We closed the file without pressure. The goal was never to force confrontation, it was to restore choice. The anniversary of the Ravenwood meeting passed without notice. No statement, no commemoration. I spent the day in meetings, then drove home in the dark. Passing a neighborhood with a private gate, I noticed the security vehicle idling, lights off. The uniform was different, the badge unmistakably not police. Clear signage outlined limits of authority. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress measured in inches rather than miles. At home, I added one more line to the whiteboard I'd kept since the beginning, now mostly erased. Abuse imitates legitimacy. Beneath it, another. Accountability outlasts imitation. Then I wiped the board clean. Some tools are meant to be put away. The work would continue through others now, attorneys, residents, regulators, each carrying pieces forward. That was how it should be. No single figure at the center, no throne to dismantle later, just systems that resist being bent too far in any one direction. I slept better than I had in years, not because everything was fixed, but because enough had changed to make fixing possible.
Time changed the shape of the case, but not its weight. As Ravenwood faded from headlines, its consequences settled into policy rooms, court dockets, and ordinary conversations where people learned the words to name what had happened to them. I watched it happen from a distance I hadn't allowed myself before. The defense fund no longer felt like an emergency response, it felt like infrastructure. Intake calls slowed into a steady rhythm, patterns sharpened, the work matured. I stopped measuring progress by arrests and started measuring it by prevention, by the number of situations that never escalated because someone recognized the warning signs early and stepped back with support behind them. One afternoon, a county official asked for a briefing, informal but pointed. He'd read the filings, seen the judgments, and wanted to know how Ravenwood slipped past oversight for so long. I explained how private authority borrows credibility from public trust, how ambiguity does most of the damage, how enforcement thrives when no one agrees on who should intervene. He nodded, scribbling notes. Weeks later, his office released updated guidance clarifying the limits of private security in residential communities. It wasn't sweeping reform, it was specific and enforceable, the kind of change that actually holds. Not everyone welcomed it. A regional HOA consortium circulated a memo warning members to maintain independence and resist external interference. The language was defensive, the tone brittle. They framed accountability as hostility. It told me everything I needed to know about who felt threatened. We didn't respond publicly. We didn't need to. The record spoke louder than any press release. Back in Ravenwood, the new association faced its first real test. A dispute over parking spiraled into accusations and raised voices at a meeting. Old habits surfaced. Someone suggested calling security. Someone else demanded fines. The chair shut it down. Mediation was scheduled. Tempers cooled. The system held. I wasn't there, but I heard about it later from Elaine, who described the moment with a smile that mixed relief and disbelief. We argued, she said, and then we went home. That was the victory. I returned in early spring to review lease renewals and maintenance plans. We walked the grounds with clipboards and coffee, talking about drainage, lighting, and pedestrian access. No one flinched when a car slowed nearby. No one reached for a radio. Children practiced riding bikes in loops that cut across sidewalks and driveways. It looked ordinary because it was. The absence of spectacle was the point.
The fund's second year brought cases that tested patience more than resolve. A development dissolved its HOA days before a hearing, scattering records across storage units and personal laptops. Another rebranded its security firm and claimed the problems were legacy issues. We tracked continuity, names, accounts, contracts, connecting dots that tried to slip away. Sometimes accountability arrived as injunctions and settlements. Sometimes it arrived as quiet compliance after a single demand letter. The latter felt anticlimactic, but it mattered just as much. I spent a week embedded with a municipal training group reviewing how police departments should interact with private communities. The goal wasn't turf, it was clarity. Officers described confusion when called to gates with flashing lights already present, residents already detained. We mapped protocols. Who assumes control? How authority is asserted? When private security steps back? Ambiguity feeds abuse. Clear lines starve it. Late one evening, a call came from a town 2 states over. An elderly couple had been threatened with detention for violating a noise policy after hosting their granddaughter. The words matched the script I'd heard before. We connected them with counsel. The HOA backed down within 48 hours. No lawsuit, no hearing, just a line drawn early enough to hold. The couple sent a note later, handwritten, apologizing for bothering us. I wish they wouldn't. Reaching out wasn't a bother, it was the work. As months passed, invitations arrived, panels, workshops, advisory boards. I declined most. Attention can distort incentives. I accepted the ones that promised concrete outcomes. At a regional summit, a regulator asked me what surprised me most about Ravenwood after everything came out. I told him it wasn't the cruelty, it was the banality, how easily routine paperwork masked harm, how quickly people adapt when harm wears a uniform. He wrote that down. On the anniversary of the meeting where everything broke open, I didn't mark the day. I spent it reviewing a draft policy with a state agency and answering emails. In the evening, I walked my neighborhood without thinking about gates or lights. That mattered too. The last loose end from Ravenwood closed quietly. A civil appeal resolved. Funds distributed. Files sealed. The bench near the park weathered coup winter and emerged scuffed and solid. The inscription remained legible. People sat there without ceremony. That mattered more than plaques or speeches. I boxed up the remaining case materials and archived them. Not erased, preserved. Stories don't disappear when cases end. They wait. The whiteboard stayed blank. I didn't fill it again. When people asked if I missed the clarity of the investigation, the villains, the confrontations, I told them no. Clarity is a luxury. Stability is the goal. You don't miss storms once roofs stop leaking. One afternoon, a student intern asked what advice I'd give to someone starting this kind of work. I told her to learn to listen without rushing towards solutions, to document before demanding, to remember that most people don't want revenge, they want relief. She nodded, then asked how to keep going when progress felt slow. I said progress rarely announces itself. You notice it when old behaviors fail to reappear. As summer approached, the fund's board met to set priorities. We agreed to focus on education, templates, checklists, early warning signs, tools people could use before calling anyone else. Empowerment beats rescue. We budgeted modestly and left room for surprises. There are always surprises. I drove through Ravenwood one last time that season, not to check anything, just to pass through. The gate stood open. A small sign listed office hours. A bulletin advertised a yard sale and a movie night. Ordinary noise drifted across the road. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. Some places don't require supervision once they relearn how to govern themselves. At home, I set a book on the shelf where the files had been. The space felt earned. I turned off the light and slept without replaying scenes I'd memorized before. The work wasn't finished everywhere, but it was finished here. That was enough for one chapter.
The final phase didn't announce itself with sirens or court dates. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. That was how I knew it mattered. When a system stops producing emergencies, it means pressure has shifted upstream. Problems are intercepted earlier, resolved smaller, handled before they harden into something violent or irreversible. Ravenwood had become a reference point, not because of what happened there, but because of what stopped happening afterward. The Defense Fund's third year opened with fewer crisis calls and more consultation requests. Community boards asked for reviews of bylaws before enforcement. Residents asked whether a rule was lawful before complying. Attorneys asked for pattern comparisons instead of emergency filings. Fear had receded enough to make room for questions. Questions change outcomes. I noticed it in language first. People stopped saying, "They told me I had no rights," and started asking, "Can they actually do this?" That shift mattered. Authority survives on certainty, even when it's fake. Doubt weakens it. Knowledge breaks it. One case brought that home.
A gated community in the Midwest planned to roll out a new safety initiative involving patrol vehicles with roof lights and uniforms modeled closely after local police. A resident forwarded the proposal to us before implementation. We reviewed it, flagged the issues, cited statutes, and sent a single letter outlining liability exposure. The plan was shelved within a week. No confrontation, no arrests, just prevention. Those were the wins you never see on the news. Ravenwood's new association invited me to attend a workshop they were hosting for neighboring communities. I declined the spotlight, but agreed to sit in the back and observe. The session focused on governance basics, transparent budgets, complaint escalation paths, mediation standards. No mention of the past unless someone asked directly. When they did, the answers were factual and brief. There was no appetite for mythologizing what had happened. That was healthy. Communities don't heal by reliving trauma. They heal by normalizing accountability. Afterward, Elaine introduced me to a couple who had just moved in. They didn't know my name. They didn't need to. That anonymity felt like closure. Places aren't meant to revolve around single figures, whether villains or heroes. They're meant to function without either. I spent more time writing than investigating that year. Guidance documents, training outlines, quiet memos that moved through regulatory channels and came back changed. Progress doesn't always wear your fingerprints. Sometimes it wears no marks at all. The fund's metrics told the same story. Complaints resolved at the inquiry stage increased. Detentions reported dropped sharply. When they did occur, local law enforcement was notified immediately, which changed behavior on both sides. Transparency is a deterrent. It forces everyone to stay inside lines that matter. I received an email from Evan Brooks midway through the summer. He'd completed his probation and was finishing community service at a legal aid clinic. He didn't ask for anything. He wanted to say he understood now what he'd been part of and that he was trying to make it right in quieter ways. I wrote back once, briefly. Accountability doesn't require exile. It requires change that lasts. There were setbacks. A private security firm sued a municipality over new regulations, claiming economic harm. The case drew attention. Amicus briefs piled in. The court upheld the rules, not because of Ravenwood, but because the law had always been there, waiting to be enforced. Sometimes the system doesn't need invention, it needs activation. As the year closed, I revisited my own files, not the evidence, but the notes I'd written to myself during the early days. Short phrases, reminders, cautions. One line stood out. Don't confuse exposure with resolution. Exposure creates momentum. Resolution creates stability. The second takes longer. It's quieter. It's worth the wait. I walked through Ravenwood again in late autumn, leaves collecting along the turbs. The gate remained open during daylight, staffed by a part-time administrator who handled deliveries and questions, not enforcement. A bulletin announced a volunteer cleanup and a holiday drive. I passed the bench near the park. Someone had added a small plaque beneath the original inscription, installed by the association without ceremony. It read, "Shared spaces require shared responsibility." It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. On the drive home, I realized I hadn't checked the time. That used to matter there. Curfews had been weaponized. Time had been turned into a tool of control. Now it was just time again. Evening arrived without consequence. The fund's board met before the holidays to set the next year's focus. We voted to expand educational outreach and reduce direct intervention where possible. Build capacity locally. Make ourselves unnecessary. That was the goal from the beginning, even if it didn't feel like it at the start. A journalist requested a long-form interview to wrap the story. I declined the offer. Stories that wrap too neatly invite repetition. I offered documents instead. Public records, court opinions, policy changes. Let readers draw conclusions from facts. Drama fades, records remain. On the anniversary of the verdicts, I received a photo from Bernard Cole. The bench, dusted with frost, empty in the early morning. No caption, none was needed. Some images don't explain themselves, they just exist. I closed the fund's office early that day and went home. I cooked, I read, I slept without interruptions. The absence of urgency felt earned, not complacent. There's a difference. The work would continue, carried by others, shaped by laws and habits that had shifted just enough to matter. I didn't need to watch every gate anymore. Systems that learn don't require constant surveillance.
When I finally boxed up the last of my personal notes, I didn't shred them, I archived them alongside the case files. Memory has a purpose beyond nostalgia. It's a guardrail. As winter settled in, Ravenwood disappeared from my calendar entirely. That was the final indicator. A place that once demanded constant attention now required none. It governed itself within lines everyone could see. Somewhere along the way, the story stopped being about stopping something bad and became about making space for something ordinary. That's where it ends, even if the work doesn't.
The last shift didn't come from a courtroom or a policy memo. It came from absence. When the calls stopped clustering around emergencies and settled into occasional check-ins, I understood the cycle had closed. Ravenwood no longer appeared in subject lines or footnotes. It lived where it belonged, inside routines, not reports. The defense fund entered a maintenance phase, focused on keeping knowledge accessible rather than chasing harm already done. We archived templates, refreshed guides, updated statutes as they changed. The work looked boring from the outside. That was the point. Boredom is a sign that abuse has lost momentum. I took a step back from daily operations and handed scheduling to a coordinator who understood that urgency is a tool, not a lifestyle. My calendar opened up. Mornings slowed. I noticed details again. Light through the kitchen window, the sound of traffic without interpreting it as threat. I stopped checking my phone during walks. The habits I'd built for vigilance loosened, not because they were wrong, but because they were no longer necessary everywhere. A letter arrived from the state agency that had revised its private security standards. They enclosed the final rulemaking language and thanked contributors. The changes were narrow and practical. Clear uniform distinctions, mandatory reporting when a person's movement is restricted, penalties for impersonation that no longer depended on proving intent. It wasn't sweeping reform, it was friction. Enough friction to stop abuse from sliding downhill unchecked. I filed the letter and moved on. Ravenwood's association sent a yearly report to residents and landholders. The tone was unremarkable by design. Budgets balanced, maintenance completed, disputes resolved through mediation. The line that stayed with me was buried in the middle. No detentions reported this year. It wasn't celebrated, it was stated. That restraint mattered. Progress doesn't need banners to be real. I visited once more, not for oversight, just to pass through on the way to another town. The road curved the same way it always had. The trees had grown, branches thicker, shadows softer. The gate was open, unmanned in the afternoon. A chalk sign near the entrance advertised a bake sale. The absence of authority theater was complete. No lights, no uniforms that borrowed meaning, no rules posted in microscopic type, just directions to the office and hours when someone would be there to answer questions. At the park, the bench stood where it always had. Someone had repainted it after winter. The inscription was unchanged. A child climbed up and jumped down, repeating the motion until a parent laughed and told them to stop before someone got hurt. The exchange was ordinary, unremarkable, perfect. I didn't sit, I didn't need to. I kept walking. Back home, I closed the last open loop. The fund's board approved a plan to sunset direct intervention over the next year, shifting fully to education and referrals. Success would look like fewer files, not more. We documented lessons learned, not names, patterns, not personalities. The goal was to make replication harder than prevention. I received one more message from a resident in another community, a question about a proposed rule, not a complaint. We reviewed it together. The rule was lawful, annoying, but lawful. I told them so. They thanked me anyway. Sometimes reassurance is as valuable as resistance. As spring turned to summer, invitations thinned. The story had cooled. That was fine. I returned to work that had nothing to do with gates or badges, and everything to do with building systems that assume good faith and verify it. Trust paired with checks lasts longer than either alone. On an evening marked only by warm air and the sound of neighbors talking, I sorted through a box of personal notes I'd kept apart from the official files. Short reminders written in the margins of days that had felt endless at the time. I kept a few. I recycled the rest. Memory doesn't need clutter to function. The final note I kept was simple. Don't wait for certainty to act, wait for evidence. It had guided me through Ravenwood when certainty was manufactured and evidence was buried. It would guide whatever came next, even if next never arrived in the same way again. I slept that night without replaying scenes, without counting hours, without listening for engines outside. The quiet wasn't fragile anymore, it was stable. That's the difference between peace that depends on vigilance and peace that depends on structure. In the end, the story didn't resolve with applause or a moral. It resolved with a place becoming ordinary again, with people reclaiming time and space without permission, with systems learning how to say no to those who would borrow authority and never give it back.
That kind of ending doesn't announce itself. It persists. I turned off the light and let the day end when it wanted to. No curfew, no watch list. Just time moving forward, unremarked, exactly as it should.